The Immortal Legacy of Ramesses II. In the year 1213 BCE, a 90-year-old man insisted on climbing the steep steps of Egypt's grandest temple to perform a ritual that had kept the universe in balance for 3,000 years. His hands trembled as he lifted the sacred incense, his back bent under the weight of the double crown, yet he refused all help. This was Ramesses II, living god of Egypt, who had ruled longer than most men lived, outlived most of his 100 children, and built more monuments than all other pharaohs combined. The common people whispered that perhaps he had lived too long, that even the gods must eventually tire. But Ramesses had one final masterpiece to create, his own immortality. This is not just the story of Egypt's most powerful pharaoh. It's a tale of hubris and propaganda, of a man who fought history's largest chariot battle, signed the world's first peace treaty, and engineered the most extensive personality cult ever seen. Ramesses transformed himself from a mere king into a living legend, and in doing so, he created a template for power and fame that rulers would follow for the next 3,000 years. But as with all great stories, his greatest triumph came with a price: the fate of watching his own myth outlive everyone he ever loved. The Rise of Ramesses II. The baby who would become Ramesses II let out his first cry in a palace that hadn't existed 5 years earlier, in a city his grandfather had only recently transformed from a backwater into Egypt's military headquarters. It was 1303 BCE, and Egypt was a nation reimagining itself. The boy's father, Seti, named him after the grandfather Ramesses, born of Ra, marking him as the continuation of a new dynasty that had seized power through sheer military determination. But unlike his grandfather, a common soldier who had climbed to the throne, this child was born into power. From his first breath, he was surrounded by the intricate machinery of divine kingship. Young Ramesses spent his earliest years in the sprawling palace complex of Avaris, where the clash of bronze swords from the training grounds mixed with the chants of priests and the cries of waterfowl from the Nile Delta marshes. His father, then Egypt's top general, took unprecedented steps in preparing his son for power. At age 4, Ramesses was given his own military commission, a symbolic gesture that nonetheless sent shockwaves through the court. By 7, he was accompanying royal hunting expeditions, learning to drive a chariot across the desert at speeds that terrified his tutors. The boy proved a natural showman, as comfortable in the spotlight as his father was reserved. The defining moment of his youth came at age 10, when his father, Seti, achieved what the family had spent generations pursuing: the throne of Egypt itself. Suddenly, young Ramesses wasn't just a noble's privileged son. He was heir to the two lands, future living god, responsible for maintaining the cosmic order itself. Lesser princes might have buckled under such pressure. Ramesses thrived on it. When Seti appointed him Prince Regent at the unprecedented age of 14, the young man already carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never doubted his own destiny. But destiny, Ramesses would learn, came with a price. The teenage prince watched as his father struggled to rebuild a kingdom that had nearly collapsed during the religious upheavals of the previous dynasty. He witnessed firsthand how the Hittites, Egypt's rivals to the north, tested the empire's borders, probing for weakness. Most importantly, he observed how his father meticulously reconstructed Egypt's relationship with its gods, rebuilding temples and restoring old ceremonies that had been abandoned. These early lessons in the connection between religious power and political stability would shape his entire reign. By his late teens, Ramesses had grown into a striking figure, tall for the era, with strong features that he knew how to use to full effect in public ceremonies. The official court sculptures show an almost impossibly perfect young prince, but contemporary accounts suggest the reality wasn't far off. He had inherited his father's military prowess and his grandfather's charisma, combining them with an ambition entirely his own. When he led his first solo military expedition at age 16, veteran commanders noted that he showed not just courage, but a theatrical flair for leadership that would become his trademark. He wasn't just fighting battles, he was already crafting the legend of Ramesses the Great. The ambitious rise of Prince Ramesses. The first time Prince Ramesses led a full army north, he ordered his men to stop at the fortress of Charu, Egypt's eastern frontier post. There, carved into ancient stone, stood victory inscriptions of Thutmose III, Egypt's greatest warrior pharaoh. As his officers watched, the young prince traced the hieroglyphs with his fingers. "Make sure the scribes leave space," he reportedly told his chief chronicler. "We'll be adding our own victories soon enough." The campaign that followed demonstrated both the prince's audacity and his flair for self-promotion. While his father Seti secured Egypt's traditional territories in the south, Ramesses drove his chariot forces deep into Canaan, targeting the small kingdoms that had begun flirting with Hittite alliance. He wasn't just fighting rebels, he was staging elaborate public demonstrations of power. Before each battle, he would appear before enemy walls in full regalia, standing in a chariot of electrum and gold, deliberately evoking imagery of the sun god Ra descending in his solar bark. When cities surrendered without a fight, he credited his divine presence. When they resisted, he unleashed a military machine that had been perfected over generations. Behind the pageantry lay a keen strategic mind. Ramesses had studied the reports of Egypt's spy networks, learning which local rulers might be turned, which needed to be eliminated, and, most importantly, where the real threat lay. The Hittite Empire to the north had spent decades expanding southward, absorbing or suborning the small kingdoms that had once served as buffers between the great powers. Now their armies were probing the edges of Egypt's sphere of influence, testing the resolve of Seti's regime. The prince's early campaigns weren't just about securing territory, they were reconnaissance missions, preparing for the inevitable clash of empires. In Memphis, during the celebration of his latest victories, Ramesses made two decisions that would shape the next half-century of history. First, he selected his great royal wife, the brilliant and politically connected Nefertari, whose family connections would help secure his position at court. Second, he began planning the construction of Ramesses, a new capital city that would serve as both a monument to his growing power and a forward military base for the campaigns he knew were coming. The scale of his ambition shocked even his supporters. The proposed city would require redirecting branches of the Nile, employing tens of thousands of workers, and depleting the royal treasury. When his father's chief architect protested the expense, Ramesses reportedly answered, "The Hittites spent a century building their capital. We'll do it in 5 years." The young prince was building something else too, a new kind of royal image. Previous pharaohs had certainly engaged in self-promotion, but Ramesses approached propaganda with an almost scientific precision. Every victory, no matter how minor, was commemorated in elaborate temple reliefs. Every construction project was accompanied by poetry praising his vision. He pioneered new artistic styles that emphasized his physical power and divine nature, creating a visual language of authority that would influence royal imagery for millennia. By the time he officially took the throne, the mythology of Ramesses the Great was already taking shape. But myths, as the Hittites were about to remind him, have a way of colliding with reality. As Ramesses finalized preparations for his greatest campaign, a thrust deep into enemy territory, his spies brought disturbing news. The Hittite king Muwatalli II had assembled the largest chariot army ever seen, drawing forces from 20 kingdoms. The clash that would define both empires was about to begin, and despite all his careful preparations, the young pharaoh had no idea he was riding into a trap that would nearly destroy everything he had built. The legendary Battle of Kadesh, a tale of triumph and near disaster. Dawn broke over the Orontes River on a spring morning in 1274 BCE, illuminating the largest army ever assembled in human history. 20,000 Egyptian troops stretched across the valley, their bronze armor catching the first rays of sun. At their center, the golden war chariot of Ramesses II gleamed like a fallen star. The young pharaoh, not yet 30, stood tall in his ceremonial armor, watching the empty hills around the city of Kadesh. 2 captured Hittite spies had just assured him that his enemy was cowering 90 miles north, afraid to face Egypt's might. Ramesses smiled, already composing the victory stela in his mind. It was at that precise moment that everything went catastrophically wrong. The spies had lied. As Ramesses began setting up camp, 10,000 Hittite chariots, the largest chariot force ever assembled, smashed into his unprepared army's flank. The Egyptian formation shattered. Veterans who survived would later describe the sound. The thunder of 20,000 horses, the screech of bronze-rimmed wheels, the screams of men being trampled and torn apart. The pharaoh's own division found itself cut off, surrounded by a sea of enemies. His personal guard broke, his shield-bearer fled, and for a crucial moment, the living god of Egypt stood alone on the battlefield, facing annihilation. What happened next transformed Ramesses from a mere king into a legend. Instead of retreating, he launched his chariot directly into the enemy's thickest concentration. Ancient texts describe him shining like the sun disk, his arrows never missing, his sword arm never tiring. Modern historians debate the details, but something extraordinary must have happened. The Hittite advance stalled, giving the rest of the Egyptian army crucial time to regroup. Whether through divine intervention, as Ramesses would claim, or desperate courage, the young pharaoh had snatched survival from the jaws of total defeat. But Ramesses' greatest victory at Kadesh came after the battle itself. Returning to Egypt with his army bloodied and the strategic situation essentially unchanged, he launched history's first comprehensive propaganda campaign. Every temple wall became a canvas for massive battle scenes showing his personal heroism. Court poets composed epic verses about his valor. Scribes produced thousands of copies of the Poem of Pentor, a carefully crafted narrative that transformed a near disaster into Egypt's greatest triumph. The Kadesh reliefs became the ancient world's equivalent of a blockbuster film franchise, with Ramesses as the starring hero. Most remarkably, he convinced his own people that an inconclusive battle fought to a desperate draw was actually their greatest military triumph. The Kadesh narrative he created of personal heroism snatching victory from defeat became so compelling that even his enemies began repeating it. When the Hittite king finally sought peace years later, he addressed Ramesses as the great victor of Kadesh, fully aware of the irony but understanding the power of the myth that had been created. In his private moments did Ramesses remember the real terror of that morning, the moment when history nearly ended his story before it truly began. We'll never know. The version of Kadesh he created, carved in stone and copied for 3,000 years, replaced whatever really happened that day. He had discovered something more powerful than military victory, the ability to shape how history itself would be remembered. It was a lesson he would spend the next 50 years putting into practice on an unprecedented scale. Ramesses II, the architect of eternity. Standing before the half-carved facade of Abu Simbel, Ramesses watched the summer solstice dawn illuminate his unfinished features. The 4 colossal statues, each as tall as a modern 7-story building, were already beginning to emerge from the living rock. But something wasn't right. "The angle is wrong," he told his master architect. "When the sun rises on my birthday, I want its rays to pierce the entire temple, to touch the faces of the gods themselves." The architect blanched. Adjusting the alignment would mean months of additional work, thousands of man-hours lost. But Ramesses was no longer building mere monuments. He was crafting machines of light and shadow that would mark his divine presence for eternity. The scale of his architectural ambition beggared description. While other pharaohs had been content to add a courtyard here, a pylon there, Ramesses reimagined the entire sacred landscape of Egypt. He doubled the size of the Luxor temple, added vast courts to Karnak, and built entirely new temple cities in Nubia. His workers quarried stones larger than any moved in human history, carved cliff faces into divine images, and pioneered engineering techniques that wouldn't be replicated for millennia. When one of his sons asked why he built on such an unprecedented scale, Ramesses reportedly answered, "So the gods will have to work harder to forget us." Behind the massive public works lay a sophisticated understanding of architecture's psychological impact. Ramesses didn't just build big, he built smart. His temples were carefully engineered to create specific emotional effects. Courtyards would suddenly narrow into darkened hallways, only to explode into light-filled chambers that seemed to float on reflected water. Walls were aligned to capture specific astronomical events, turning architecture into a kind of celestial theater. At Ramesses, his new capital, he created artificial lakes that mirrored his temples, doubling their apparent size and creating the impression of monuments suspended between earth and sky. But his most audacious architectural act was also his most subtle. Throughout Egypt, Ramesses began a systematic campaign of improving existing monuments. Ancient temples would be found to have structural problems that, remarkably, could only be fixed by adding his cartouche to their decoration. Statues of previous pharaohs developed mysterious cracks that required their faces to be recarved with his features. By the middle of his reign, it had become almost impossible to walk through any major Egyptian temple without encountering his name, his face, his presence. The line between Egypt's past and Ramesses' present was beginning to blur. The cost was staggering. Entire quarries were exhausted, forests in Lebanon stripped bare for timber, gold mines worked until they collapsed. When his treasurers protested, Ramesses pointed to the results: cities rising from sand, temples that would outlast time itself, monuments that made Egypt's rivals look like children playing with mud bricks. What his bookkeepers saw as expenses, he viewed as investments in immortality. And he was winning that bet. His monuments would still dominate Egypt's landscape 3,000 years later, still inspire awe in cultures he could never have imagined. But even as he reshaped the face of his empire in stone, forces were gathering that no amount of monumental architecture could control. The Builder King was about to face his greatest challenge, not in the quarries or temples, but in the delicate balance of international power. Ramesses, the architect of dynastic power. In the summer of his 35th year, Ramesses did something unprecedented in Egyptian history. He ordered his artisans to carve a temple to a living woman. The great cliff sanctuary at Abu Simbel would feature not just his own colossal form, but statues of his chief wife Nefertari standing as tall as his own. When his advisors questioned this break with tradition, he responded with characteristic directness. "My father made himself equal to the gods. I have made my wife equal to me." The message was unmistakable. This was more than a marriage. It was a political partnership that would reshape how Egyptian queens were viewed for generations. But Nefertari was just the most visible piece in Ramesses' grand dynastic strategy. Each morning, the pharaoh's counselors would find him already at work in his private study, managing a family network that rivaled the complexity of international diplomacy. His personal correspondence, preserved on fragile papyrus, reveals a man who tracked the activities of over 100 children with remarkable precision. He arranged marriages to solidify alliances with noble families, appointed his sons to key priesthoods and military commands, and maintained a delicate balance of power among his wives that would have exhausted a less capable politician. The women's quarters of P. Ramesses became a kind of shadow court, where princesses from every major power in the ancient world lived in carefully managed luxury. A Hittite princess might take her meals beside a Babylonian royal daughter, while Canaanite nobles' daughters studied Egyptian with Ramesses' own children. Each foreign wife brought her own priests, servants, and customs, turning the royal harem into a microcosm of the international world. When the Princess of Hatti felt slighted by her accommodation, Ramesses smoothed things over by building her an entire palace complex in the Hittite style, complete with snow gardens meant to remind her of home. But beneath the glamour lay calculated purpose. Each royal child was a living bond between Egypt and its allies or subjects. Ramesses deployed his daughters as diplomatic weapons, sending them to cement alliances with strategic marriages. His sons commanded armies, governed provinces, and maintained Egypt's religious institutions. The pharaoh was creating a human network that would bind his empire together more effectively than any conquest. At its height, his family tree included rulers of half the known world. The system's weakness lay in its very success. As his reign stretched into unprecedented lengths, Ramesses faced a unique problem: too many qualified heirs. By his 50th year of rule, he had outlived several adult crown princes. Some of his grandchildren were now older than he had been when he took the throne. The careful balance of power he had created began to show strain as different branches of the family positioned themselves for a succession that seemed perpetually delayed. In the end, it would be his 13th heir who succeeded him, a man who had spent most of his life never expecting to rule. But the greatest tragedy of Ramesses' family strategy was intensely personal. In his quest to bind the empire together through marriage alliances and careful breeding, he had created something more like a diplomatic corps than a family. When Nefertari died in his 44th year of rule, the grief that poured out in his inscriptions suggests a loss deeper than political. The man who had reshaped Egypt's concept of divine kingship had also, perhaps unwittingly, transformed the meaning of family itself. As he aged, outliving wife after wife, child after child, the pharaoh who had mastered death through monuments would learn its more intimate costs: the treaty that reshaped ancient diplomacy. For 3,000 years, diplomats, kings, and emperors would point to a single silver tablet as the moment everything changed. Inscribed in careful cuneiform, sealed with the cartouches of two great empires, the Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty marked humanity's first recorded attempt to replace the cycle of war with permanent peace. But in 1258 BCE, as Ramesses studied the Hittite king's proposal, all he saw was opportunity. While others thought in terms of battles won or lost, he had learned to think in centuries. The Hittite offer arrived at a perfect moment. Egypt was rich but stretched thin, its military strained by constant small wars. The Hittites were powerful but facing pressure from new enemies in the north. A lesser king might have seen weakness in his rival's pursuit of peace. Ramesses saw a chance to create something unprecedented, a world where trade replaced tribute, where diplomacy supplanted annual warfare. Within months, he had dispatched his most talented scribes to begin negotiating what would become humanity's first international peace treaty. The document they created was revolutionary. Beyond simple peace terms, it established mechanisms for extraditing refugees, coordinating responses to mutual threats, and ensuring royal succession in both empires. Most remarkably, it proclaimed the two former enemies brothers, equal in power and dignity, a radical departure from the usual ancient practice of claiming universal dominion. When Ramesses' court scholars objected to treating foreigners as equals, he silenced them with characteristic pragmatism. Even the sun has to share the sky with the moon. But the treaty's most profound impact came through an innovation that seemed minor at the time. Each empire received its copy not just in its own language, but in identical versions in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform. This simple diplomatic courtesy inadvertently created the ancient world's first bilingual documentation, allowing future generations to crack the code of both writing systems. 3,000 years later, archaeologists would use these parallel texts to help unlock the secrets of Egypt's lost language. The peace transformed the ancient world. Trade routes that had been closed for generations reopened. Ideas, technologies, and artistic styles that had developed in isolation began to cross-pollinate. In the decades that followed, Eastern Mediterranean civilization entered a golden age of commerce and cultural exchange. The very concept of international law of a world governed by treaties rather than merely by force traces its origins to this silver tablet. Yet perhaps the treaty's greatest triumph lay in what didn't happen. For the remaining 35 years of Ramesses' reign, despite countless opportunities for conflict, despite the skeptics in both courts who pushed for war, despite the death of kings and the rise of new powers, the peace held. The man who had once proclaimed himself the world's greatest warrior had discovered that his most lasting victory would come not through conquest, but through the patient art of making peace. As he grew older, watching his grandchildren play with the children of Hittite princes in the gardens of Ramesses, he might have reflected that this, not the monuments, not the battles, not even the gods, was his truest claim to immortality. The Twilight of Ramesses, preparing for an eternal legacy. The oldest living person in the world struggled to climb the temple steps. 92 years had bent the once towering frame. Arthritis had twisted the fingers that once drew the warbow, but Ramesses' eyes remained sharp as he surveyed his empire from Luxor's highest pylon. Below him stretched a world he had transformed so completely that few remembered what it had looked like before. Yet as he watched the sun set over his domain, the pharaoh faced a problem no ruler had encountered before: how to prepare an empire for the death of a god who had ruled for so long that he had become its foundation. Time had taken a toll no monument could resist. His beloved Ramesses, once the greatest city in the world, was slowly sinking into the delta mud as the Nile's branches shifted. The peace he had built with the Hittites held firm, but new peoples were appearing on the horizon: the mysterious sea peoples, the growing power of Assyria, the first stirrings of Greek civilization. His eldest surviving son, now older than most pharaohs lived to be, struggled to maintain authority over younger princes who had never known any Egypt but their fathers. The man who had reshaped reality to match his vision now faced a reality that refused to be commanded. His doctor's prescriptions, preserved on medical papyri, reveal the cost of living past 90 in the ancient world: severe dental abscesses, hardened arteries, arthritis that twisted his once straight spine. The mummy of the world's most powerful man shows he walked with a cane in his final years, his head permanently tilted to one side. Yet still he insisted on performing the rituals that maintained universal order, even when his trembling hands could barely lift the offerings. In his final years, Ramesses turned his legendary attention to detail toward one last monumental task: preparing Egypt for his death. He appointed his surviving son Merneptah as Prince Regent, gradually transferring power while ensuring continuity. He ordered his scribes to compile comprehensive records of everything from grain shipments to temple inventories. Most remarkably, he began composing what amounts to a manual for ruling Egypt, a collection of practical advice and political wisdom that survives in fragments today. But his greatest challenge was psychological. How could a living god prepare his people for his death? How could the man who had made himself synonymous with Egypt convince his subjects that Egypt would continue without him? His solution was characteristically grandiose. He began preparing for his own apotheosis. His tomb in the Valley of the Kings would be no mere sepulchre, but a transformation chamber where Ramesses the man would officially become Ramesses the eternal god. His funeral arrangements, planned with obsessive detail, would be designed not to mourn an ending, but to celebrate a metamorphosis. In his final month, too weak to leave his palace at Ramesses, the old king summoned his chief sculptor. His last recorded words to the artist were simple: "Make sure they remember us." He died as he had lived, composing his own legend. When the end came in his 96th year, after 67 years on the throne, Egypt faced a dawn it had not seen in 3 generations, a morning without Ramesses the Great. The sun god Ra, whom the pharaoh had claimed as his personal father, rose as it always had. The Nile flooded on schedule. Life continued. But nothing would ever be quite the same. An age had ended, and the world's first celebrity, the man who had transformed himself into a myth, had finally become one with the eternal gods he had spent his life emulating. The enduring legacy of Ramesses the Great. When archaeologists opened Ramesses' tomb in 1881, they faced a mystery. The mummy of Egypt's greatest pharaoh, the man who had built more monuments than any ruler in history, lay in a plain wooden coffin marked with hasty notations. It had been moved there centuries after his death, hidden away by priests who feared tomb robbers. Yet even in this humble final resting place, Ramesses had the last laugh. His body was better preserved than any other royal mummy ever found, his features so intact that modern forensic artists could reconstruct his face without guesswork. Even in death, he had managed to outlast all his rivals. The discovery electrified the modern world. Journalists, poets, and artists flocked to see the face of the man who had inspired Shelley's Ozymandias. When his mummy arrived at the Cairo Museum, the Egyptian government ordered a full military honor guard, the first time a 3,000-year-old corpse had been given a formal state reception. The director of the museum noted in his diary that modern Egyptian soldiers instinctively saluted as they passed their ancient commander-in-chief. Time, it seemed, had not dimmed Ramesses' ability to command respect. His true legacy, however, lies not in his mummy or even his monuments, but in how he transformed the very concept of power itself. He was the first ruler to understand that authority wasn't just about force or wealth. It was about narrative, about controlling the story of power. Every emperor who built triumph arches, every dictator who erected gigantic statues, every leader who carefully crafted their public image was following a template Ramesses created. He invented personal branding 3,000 years before Madison Avenue, propaganda before the printing press, and celebrity culture before the concept of celebrity existed. Yet perhaps his most remarkable achievement was one he never intended. His obsession with documenting everything, from epic battles to grocery lists, left us the most complete picture of any ancient civilization. Through his monuments, inscriptions, and papyri, we know more about life in his time than any comparable period in human history. The details of ordinary existence under his reign, what people ate, how they lived, what they believed, survive in startling clarity. He meant to immortalize himself, but in doing so, he accidentally immortalized his entire world. Modern Egypt still lives in Ramesses' shadow. His monuments drive its tourist industry, his image appears on its currency, and his name adorns everything from streets to cigarette brands. When the Aswan High Dam threatened to drown his temples in the 1960s, the world spent the modern equivalent of $1 billion to move them to higher ground. The man who had devoted his life to ensuring he wouldn't be forgotten had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. In the end, Ramesses' greatest monument wasn't carved in stone, it was carved in time. He ruled so long, built so much, and documented everything so thoroughly that he became more than just a king or even a god. He became a bridge between worlds, a human link between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, between the era of chariot warfare and the first stirrings of classical civilization. Through him, we can reach out and touch a world that would otherwise be lost to us. 3,000 years after his death, Ramesses the Great is still teaching us what it means to be remembered,